You're standing in the gardens at dawn. The marble is cool beneath your feet. There's blood on the pathway, not yours, not yet. You can hear soldiers' boots echoing through the colonnade, getting closer. Your mother is beside you, pressing a dagger into your trembling hands, whispering that this is the only dignified way, but you can't do it. You've had everything: absolute power, impossible pleasure, the worship of an empire, and now at 28 years old, you're about to lose it all in the next 60 seconds. This is the final moment of Valeria Messalina, Empress of Rome, and the story of how she arrived here is darker, stranger, and more complicated than anything you've been told. Before we go any further, drop a comment and tell me where you're watching from, honestly. It never stops amazing me that a scandal from 2,000 years ago still reaches every corner of the planet, still makes us lean forward and whisper. Let's go back. Rome, 48 A.D., the most powerful woman in the known world is about to be executed for treason. But the treason isn't what you think. And the woman Messalina might not be the monster history painted her as. What we know for certain is this: she was married to Emperor Claudius, a man 3 decades older, a man who stuttered and limped and drooled, a man the Roman elite had once dismissed as a fool. She gave him a son, Britannicus, the heir to the throne. She had wealth that could buy cities. She had influence that could topple senators. And according to every Roman historian who wrote about her after her death, she had an appetite for power, for control, for pleasure that terrified everyone who came near her. The stories about Messalina are so extreme they've survived 2 millennia. Poets, playwrights, painters, filmmakers, they've all returned to her again and again, obsessed with one particular night. The night she supposedly challenged a professional prostitute to a competition. The night she allegedly took 25 men to bed, one after another, and kept going even when her opponent collapsed in exhaustion. The night that made her name synonymous with insatiable desire for the next 2,000 years. But here's what nobody talks about. Almost everything written about Messalina was written by men who hated her, men who needed her to be a monster, men who were writing years or even decades after she died. So what's real? What's propaganda? And why does her story still grip us so tightly we can't look away? To understand the night that made her infamous, you have to understand the world that created her. Messalina was born around 20 A.D. into the Iuli Claudi, one of the most powerful bloodlines in Rome. Her family tree connected directly to Augustus, the emperor who had transformed Rome from a republic into an empire. She wasn't just wealthy. She was royalty by every Roman standard that mattered. She had pale skin that Roman poets praised, golden hair that set her apart, aristocratic features that opened every door before she even spoke. By the time she was 17, her family had arranged her marriage to Claudius, a distant imperial relative nobody took seriously. He was nearly 50. He had physical disabilities that made the Roman elite mock him behind his back. He stammered when he spoke. He was clumsy. He spent his days buried in historical research because nobody wanted him at their dinner parties. Messalina's marriage to him was purely dynastic, 2 branches of the imperial family joining bloodlines. Nobody expected it to matter. Then, in 41 A.D., Emperor Caligula was murdered. Caligula had spent 4 years terrorizing Rome with his madness. He declared himself divine. He slept with his sisters in public. He executed people on whims. He appointed his horse to the Senate just to humiliate the aristocracy. Finally, his own Praetorian guards, the elite soldiers sworn to protect him, stabbed him to death in an underground palace corridor. Rome had no emperor. Civil war loomed. The Praetorian Guard searched the palace, desperately for anyone from the imperial family they could elevate before the Senate seized control. They found Claudius hiding behind a curtain, literally shaking with terror. They dragged him out, proclaimed him emperor, and overnight everything changed. Messalina, barely 21 years old, woke up as Empress of Rome. Her awkward, overlooked husband was suddenly the most powerful man on earth, and she was the most powerful woman. Think about what that meant. She commanded thousands of slaves. She lived in palaces that covered entire hillsides. She wore jewels worth more than most Romans would earn in 10 lifetimes. She could elevate families with a word, destroy reputations with a whisper. And she'd given Claudius a son, Britannicus, which meant her child would one day rule the world. Most women would have stopped there. Most women would have enjoyed the security, the status, the safety, but Messalina didn't stop. She couldn't stop. Or maybe she wouldn't stop. The distinction matters, and we still don't know which is true. The Roman historians, Tacitus, Suetonius, Pliny the Elder, Juvenal, they all wrote about Messalina, and what they wrote was explosive. They claimed she had affairs constantly, compulsively, with senators, military commanders, even actors, which was particularly shocking because Romans considered actors barely above slaves. They claimed she didn't just seduce these men, she coerced them. If a man refused her, he might be accused of treason. He might lose his position. He might disappear. So men didn't refuse. They couldn't. The Empress wanted them, and survival meant compliance. One story appears again and again. Messalina became obsessed with an actor named Nestor. When he tried to resist her advances, she went directly to Emperor Claudius and demanded he order Nestor to obey the Empress in all things. Claudius, apparently completely oblivious to what was actually happening, agreed. Nestor was now legally required by imperial command to sleep with the emperor's wife. It was madness playing out in the open, and nobody could stop it. But the affairs were just the beginning. According to the poet Juvenal, Messalina had a secret life that went far beyond palace intrigue. He wrote that she would wait until Claudius fell asleep at night, then disguise herself a cheap blonde wig to hide her dark hair, worn clothing that smelled of the streets, no jewelry, nothing that would identify her as nobility, and slip out through a hidden passage. She'd walk through the dark alleys of Rome toward the Subura district, the worst part of the city, where criminals hid in shadows and disease festered in crumbling tenements. And she'd go to a brothel, not to observe, not to hide, to work. Juvenal claims she took the working name Lysiska, the she-wolf, and stood in the doorway of a brothel cubicle with her nipples painted gold, calling out to passing men like any common prostitute. He says she'd work through the night, servicing customer after customer, and even when dawn came and the brothel closed, she still wasn't satisfied. She'd drag herself back to the palace exhausted but still wanting more. Now, you're right to be skeptical. Juvenal was writing satire. He was exaggerating to make Romans confront the moral decay he saw in the empire. But here's the problem. Multiple sources tell similar stories, and one story in particular keeps appearing, told by different writers with slightly different details, but the same shocking core. The story of the competition. This account comes from Pliny the Elder, a respected natural historian who wasn't writing poetry or satire. He was writing what he believed to be scientific fact. According to Pliny, Messalina decided to settle a question: who had greater sexual stamina, an empress or a professional prostitute? So she challenged Scylla, one of Rome's most famous courtesans, to a competition. The rules were brutally simple. Both women would take on as many male partners as possible over 24 hours. Whoever serviced more men would win, and this wasn't done in secret. Pliny suggests this was witnessed by members of the Roman nobility. Messalina had turned her sexuality into public spectacle. The competition began. Scylla, being a professional who understood pacing and endurance, worked steadily through the night. By dawn she had serviced 25 men. It was an extraordinary performance. She was completely exhausted. She couldn't continue. She'd reached her absolute physical limit. But Messalina kept going. She continued past 30. Some sources suggest she went even higher. She only stopped when there were literally no more volunteers left, when every man present was too exhausted to continue. Messalina won. The Empress of Rome had defeated a professional prostitute in a marathon of sexual endurance, and she'd done it in front of an audience of Roman nobles. Pliny records this matter-of-factly in his natural history, writing about it when discussing differences between human and animal sexual behavior. He states it as data: Messalina, wife of Claudius Caesar, thinking this a poem quite worthy of an empress, selected for the purpose one of the most notorious hired prostitutes, and the empress outdid her after continuous intercourse, night and day, at the 25th embrace. So we have to ask, why? Why would the most powerful woman in the world do this? Messalina had everything. She could have had any lover she wanted in private. Why turn sexuality into public competition? Why risk the catastrophic scandal that would come if these stories spread beyond her circle of witnesses? Modern historians have debated this for decades. Some argue she was genuinely compulsive, someone with an uncontrollable sexual appetite that modern psychology might classify as hypersexuality. Others suggest it was entirely about power. Roman women had almost no official power. They couldn't vote, couldn't hold office, couldn't own property in their own names. But an empress could wield enormous unofficial power through her husband. And Messalina may have realized she could gain even more power through sex. By seducing powerful men, she gained leverage over them. By forcing noble women to participate in or witness her schemes, she gained blackmail material. By making her sexuality so extreme and so visible, she created an atmosphere of fear and unpredictability. Nobody knew what she might do next. Nobody felt safe refusing her. She weaponized desire itself. But there's another possibility historians are increasingly considering. Maybe this was propaganda. Maybe Messalina's enemies, and she had many spread these stories to destroy her reputation after she was gone. After all, almost every account we have was written by men who lived after her death, men with political reasons to portray her as monstrous. Roman history is filled with powerful women slandered by male historians. Cleopatra was called a seductress when she was actually a brilliant political strategist. Agrippina, who came after Messalina, was accused of incest with her son Nero, despite no credible evidence. So maybe Messalina is just another victim of historical character assassination. Maybe she did have affairs, scandalous but not unusual among Roman nobility, and her enemies turned those affairs into grotesque legends to justify what came next. Because what came next was brutal. In 48 A.D., Messalina fell in love. His name was Gaius Silius. He was young, handsome, intelligent, ambitious. He was also a consul, one of the highest political positions in Rome. Messalina became obsessed with him. Silius saw opportunity. If he could marry the Empress, if they could somehow remove Claudius, Silius could become emperor. They began plotting, but they got reckless, impatient, intoxicated by their own daring. While Claudius was away from Rome on official business, Messalina and Silius did something absolutely insane. They got married. They held an actual wedding ceremony, witnessed by Roman nobles, legally binding according to Roman law. This wasn't a secret affair anymore. This was public bigamy. This was open treason. This was political suicide. When Claudius found out, he was devastated. But his advisers and the Praetorian Guard were furious. This couldn't stand. Messalina had crossed the only line that mattered. Claudius ordered her arrest. Messalina fled to the gardens of Lucullus, a beautiful estate on the edge of Rome that she'd acquired through political maneuvering. She knew what was coming. Roman law was clear. Treason meant death. Bigamy was grounds for execution, and she'd committed both crimes publicly, in front of witnesses. There was no escape, no way to seduce or manipulate her way to safety this time. She had her mother with her, Domitia Lepida, the only person who still cared about her fate. Domitia begged her daughter to take her own life before the executioners arrived. It would be more dignified, more Roman, more in control. Romans believed suicide in the face of inevitable death was honorable, a final act of agency. But Messalina couldn't do it. She held the dagger in her trembling hands. She pressed the point against her throat again and again. But she couldn't push it in. She was too afraid. She wanted desperately to live, even though she knew she had no future. So she waited. The soldiers arrived, a tribune of the Praetorian Guard sent by Claudius with explicit orders. There was no trial, no chance to defend herself, no opportunity to see Claudius one last time. The tribune drew his sword. Domitia Lepida held her daughter as the blade came down. Messalina died there in the gardens, stabbed to death in front of her mother, her blood soaking into the expensive marble pathways she'd once walked as Empress. She was around 28 years old. She'd been Empress for 7 years. In those 7 years, she'd become the most notorious woman in Rome, and now she was gone. Her children suffered fates almost worse than her own. Britannicus, her son, who was supposed to become emperor, was only 7 when his mother was executed. Claudius remarried quickly to Agrippina, who brought her own son Nero into the imperial family. Agrippina systematically sidelined Britannicus, promoting Nero as the rightful heir. When Claudius died, Nero became emperor. Shortly after, Britannicus died suddenly at a dinner party. Most historians believe Nero poisoned him. Messalina's daughter, Octavia, was forced to marry Nero. He treated her with casual cruelty, eventually divorcing her on false adultery charges and having her executed. Both of Messalina's children died young and violently, victims of the same political machinery their mother had once tried to control. But Messalina herself wasn't forgotten. She became legendary. For 2,000 years, her name has echoed through Western culture. Renaissance painters depicted her in brothel doorways. Victorian moralists used her as a cautionary tale. 20th century filmmakers cast her as the ultimate femme fatale. Her story shaped how civilization thought about female sexuality, about power, about the decadence of Rome itself. For centuries, calling a woman a Messalina was one of the cruelest insults imaginable. But modern historians are questioning everything. They're looking at the sources more critically, noticing patterns. The accusations against Messalina, promiscuity, poisoning, manipulating a weak husband, these were standard slanders used against any powerful Roman woman who threatened male authority. They're recognizing that Messalina was actually politically active and effective. She influenced appointments, managed patronage networks, secured positions for allies. She was doing exactly what emperors did, using the power available to her. But because she was a woman, these actions were reinterpreted as sexual manipulation. The story of the 25 men might be complete fiction. Pliny wasn't even in Rome when Messalina was alive. He was a young man studying elsewhere, reporting gossip and rumors years after her death. Juvenal was writing satirical exaggeration decades later, deliberately shocking readers to criticize Roman morality. The story of her working in a brothel under a false name that might have been invented specifically to humiliate her memory, because accusing a Roman woman of prostitution was the most devastating character assassination possible. So maybe Messalina was just a young woman who became empress before she was ready, who tried to exert power in the only ways available to her, who made a fatal political miscalculation when she fell in love with Silius. Maybe the sex stories are exaggerations or complete fabrications meant to justify her execution and erase her political significance. Or maybe some of it was true. Maybe she really did have numerous affairs. Maybe she really did use sexuality as a political weapon. Maybe she really was extraordinarily sexually active by any standard. The truth is, we'll never know for certain. The real Messalina is lost forever, buried under 2,000 years of propaganda and legend and cultural projection. But her story survives. And that story, whether based on truth or lies or some impossible mixture of both, tells us something profound. It tells us about a world where women had agency only through their bodies,